painting had been hanging in the wrong room for a decade, and the room had been telling everyone it was in the right one. That was what Caleb Ellison thought as he stood outside the Whitcomb Museum on the night of the opening. With the snow coming down in thin, deliberate curtains and the light from inside the building moving through the tall windows in warm rectangles across the white steps. He had been standing outside for about 4 minutes. His coat was wet at the shoulders. June was beside him, her hand in her cupcake-shaped wool hat pulled to her eyebrows, holding the sketchbook wrapped in a Ziploc bag against her chest with both arms. The museum's exterior was what they called neoclassical, which meant columns and stone, and a kind of architectural seriousness that was designed to communicate that the things inside were worth the architecture. Tonight it was also covered in small lights, tasteful, amber, distributed along the roofline and down the stairs. And there was a red carpet, literal red carpet, running from the sidewalk to the doors, with velvet stanchions on either side, and 2 men in dark coats stationed at the entrance. Beyond them, through the glass, Kate could see the party. The guests in their good clothes moving through the gallery with glasses of white wine, the high ceilings, the ambient music. The large lighting fixture in the center of the main hall, throwing its light down onto what had been positioned as the centerpiece of the exhibition. The woman in blue light, attributed to the late European master Adrian Vale, valued at $40 million, purchased 18 months ago by a private collector, and loaned to the Whitcomb for the retrospective. The reviews had used words like luminous and hauntingly interior. One critic had written that the painting seemed to carry inside it a knowledge of feminine solitude that transcended the painter's own experience, which was true, though not in the sense the critic intended. Caleb knew what the painting carried inside it because he had watched his wife carry it there. "Daddy," she was 8 years old and her nose was getting red from the cold. "Can we go in?" "In a minute," he said. He was looking at the invitation in his hand. Not a VIP card, but a general admission ticket that his friend Arthur Bell had sent him 2 weeks ago with a note that said simply, "I thought you should see it." A debt was attached to those words that Arthur had been carrying for years and had not yet paid, and Caleb had understood this from the note without needing the debt explained. The exhibition had been announced 6 weeks ago. Caleb had read the catalog online. In the kitchen of the apartment he and June shared, with the evening news on the small television in the corner, and the smell of the pasta he'd been cooking. He had read the catalog description of the woman in blue light. The composition, the technique, the characteristic use of layered blue-black tones over a warm underpainting, and he set the laptop down on the table and sat with his hands folded in front of him for approximately 3 minutes. Then he had called his attorney. He had been calling attorneys. Off and on for 6 years, the results had been various. The case was difficult because Mara was dead, and the transfer of the painting from her hands to Adrian Vale's reputation had happened at a point in time when she was a young black woman doing contract work in a white European artist's studio, with no union, no agent, no gallery representation, and no expectation that the people around her would protect what she created when the creation was worth protecting. The case was difficult because the art world's authentication apparatus, the provenance committees, the estate reviewers, the auction house experts, had a built-in bias toward established names and a specific resistance to revisiting attributions that were generating revenue. The case was difficult because the people who knew what Mara had told Caleb, that Adrian Vale had, in the last months before she left the studio, taken a canvas she had been developing and incorporated her work into his own without acknowledgement, were people who moved in circles that valued their standing in those circles more than any individual truth. Caleb had not given up. He had been a specific, quiet, non-dramatic kind of persistent that people outside the situation frequently misread as acceptance. He had kept every sketchbook. He had kept every letter Mara had written. He had kept a box of photographs from the studio years, printed on that particular glossy paper of the mid-2000s that gives photographs a warmth that digital images lack. He had kept Mara's tools, her brushes, her pigment notes, the small journal in which she had recorded every mixing decision, with the precision of someone who understood that art was not magic but chemistry, and that chemistry could be documented. He worked in a restoration shop 4 days a week. He repaired frames, cleaned canvases, matched gilt. It was work that required the ability to look very closely at how things had been made, to understand the sequence of layers, to read the decisions of a long-dead artist in the physical structure of the object they had left behind. It was, in some ways, the exact skill set required for what he was trying to do. He knew how to see inside a painting. He had been the only person in the situation who did. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. This is a story that deserves every voice it can find. Mara had begun working in Adrian Vale's studio in the late 1990s. She had been 22 years old, recently graduated from an art program in Philadelphia, and she had gotten the position through a combination of talent and luck, and the connection of a professor who knew someone who knew Adrian's studio manager. The work involved assisting with preparatory drawings, color studies, stretching canvases, grinding pigments for the older formulations that Adrian still preferred, the invisible labor of art production that studio assistants have been performing for painters for 400 years, and for which painters have received the credit for roughly the same period. She was also, in her own time, making her own work. The Woman in Blue Light had begun as a study Mara was developing in her personal sketchbook. She had been thinking about the experience of interiority, specifically the interiority of a woman who has become so thoroughly interior that the light around her takes on her color. She had made dozens of studies. The figure developed slowly through many sessions, finding the particular angle of the head, the position of the left hand, the fall of the light through a window that was not depicted, but whose presence organized the entire composition. She had a way of building form in layers, working from a warm reddish underpainting toward the cool blues that defined the final surface, a technique she had developed herself, and that was distinct from Adrian's characteristic approach. She had left the studio in the early 2000s, after a period of increasing tension that she had described to Caleb in partial detail, and that he had reconstructed more completely from the context of what came afterward. She had told him, shortly before June was born, that there was a canvas she had worked on at the studio that she was not sure she would ever see again, and that she had her sketchbooks and her photographs and her notes, and that she hoped someday someone would look at them carefully. She had said, "If they take the painting, Caleb, don't let them take my name." She had died 18 months later. The cause was a cardiac condition that had been present for years without being fully identified, in the way that some conditions in young black women are not fully identified because the people responsible for the identification are not sufficiently attentive. June had been 6 months old. Caleb had stood at the gravesite with June in a carrier strapped to his chest and thought, not her name. He had kept that promise with the specific grinding, unglamorous effort of a man who has been in an unequal situation long enough to understand that the only thing he can control is whether he stops. He had not stopped, and now, 6 years later, he was standing in the snow outside a museum that was displaying his wife's painting under another man's name, and he was going inside. The guard at the door looked at his ticket and at the sketchbook bag. "No outside art inside the gallery, sir. It's documentation." Caleb said, "I need to speak with the curator." The guard radioed. A woman with silver hair and a fur collar paused on her way up the steps and said, with the particular amusement of someone who finds the pretensions of others mildly entertaining, another one with a family claim. June squeezed her father's hand. Dr. Julian Mercer came to the door after 8 minutes, which was 6 minutes longer than it should have taken, and he looked the way he always looked, like a man performing authority for an audience he had never stopped imagining. He was in his early 50s, with the kind of face that had been handsome and knew it, and was adjusting poorly to the knowing being less current than it once was. He had spent 30 years building a reputation as one of the foremost authentication authorities in American art institutions, and the reputation had made him, over time, less open to being wrong than the evidence of specific situations warranted. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the sketchbook. "Mr. Ellison," he said, "we've been through this. Your inquiry was reviewed by our authentication committee 18 months ago." "The authentication committee reviewed the paperwork," Caleb said. "No one reviewed what's inside the painting. The provenance is documented through 3 prior owners. The provenance documents when hands changed. It doesn't document whose hands made it." Mercer glanced at June with the specific discomfort of a man who would prefer not to be having a difficult conversation in the presence of a child, as if the child's presence was an imposition rather than a fact. June looked back at him with the steady, dark-eyed attention of a child who has been in difficult conversations for most of her life and has learned to be a witness rather than a participant. Caleb opened the sketchbook. Inside were 43 pages of studies for The Woman in Blue Light, dated in Mara's handwriting, annotated in Mara's pigment notes, showing the progression of the figure from first conception to final form. The figure's posture, the angle of the head, the position of the left hand, identical to the painting inside. Mercer studied the open pages for approximately 6 seconds. "These are personal studies," he said. "Artists work from common references. There can be convergences without causality. The left hand, Caleb said. The particular angle of the wrist. Mara broke her left wrist when she was 17 and it healed with a slight deviation. Every figure she painted with an exposed left hand had that deviation. It's in every study here. It's in the painting. Mercer closed the sketchbook and handed it back. Anecdotal evidence of personal style does not constitute proof of authorship. I know, Caleb said. That's why I've been asking for 6 years for someone to conduct a technical examination. The painting needs to be examined under ultraviolet. Mara signed her work with a particular inscription on the back canvas layer. Not the surface, the layer underneath. Mr. Ellison. She told me, Caleb said. Before June was born, she said she put it there. She said, they might take the painting, but they can't take what's inside it without destroying it. June said quietly, Mara Ellison, for my daughter. Mercer looked at her. She had said it the way children say things that they have memorized not to perform them, but because they are important and the body holds important things close. The way a phone number is held, or a prayer. She had heard her father say it many times. She knew the inscription before she knew what an inscription was. Mercer said, security, please escort. Inside the gallery. In the main hall, the preparatory technical check for the live broadcast segment had been running for 20 minutes. The Whitcomb had partnered with an arts media organization to stream a portion of the opening, and the technical team had been positioning their lighting, including an ultraviolet instruction light intended for a different purpose, verifying that the display lighting met the conservation conditions specified in the loan agreement when the light was inadvertently left in the wrong orientation. The ultraviolet light swept across the surface of the woman in blue light, and there, in the lower left corner of the canvas, in the layer beneath the oil surface, in the older stratum that Mara had prepared before the final painting was worked over it, a script appeared in thin, dark red lines, not Adrian Vale's signature, not the authentication committee's stamp. Letters in a hand that Caleb recognized the way he recognized the sound of a voice remembered from years ago. Mara Ellison, for my daughter, June 1998. The broadcast technician, who had been adjusting a cable 2 feet away, looked at the screen showing the UV output and said, "What is that?" Lena Brooks, the young conservator who had been overseeing the technical conditions for the exhibition, came over and looked. She had been responsible for the pre-exhibition condition report. She had not conducted a full UV survey because the painting's provenance had been certified, and a full survey had not been in the scope of her assignment, and because Dr. Mercer had communicated, in the way that people in authority communicate things without quite saying them, that the exhibition timeline did not accommodate exploratory technical inquiry. She looked at the UV screen. She looked at the inscription. She had a particular feeling that she would describe later in the independent review as the feeling of knowing something before you have decided whether knowing it is safe. She had been in the field long enough to understand that an institution's reputation and an artwork's truth are not always pointed in the same direction, and that a young conservator's career progresses more easily when she doesn't force the question of which direction to go. She looked at the inscription again. She picked up her radio. In the doorway, the guard had his hand on Caleb's shoulder. Caleb had not moved. June was looking up at the painting through the glass of the entrance lobby. The exhibition was visible from where they stood, and she could see the main hall, the center of the room, the painting, under the lights. The UV light was still on. June said, "Daddy." Caleb looked. Through the glass in the center of the main hall, on the surface of a painting that had been displayed for decades under a name that was not the right name, in letters that had been waiting under layers of oil and varnish for someone to ask the right question with the right light, were the words, Mara Ellison. The guard's hand dropped from Caleb's shoulder. Caleb stood in the cold entry for a moment that had the quality of the first breath after a long time without air. He did not make a sound. June looked at him and then at the painting and then at him again. "Daddy," she said. "That's Mommy's name." He did not respond immediately. He was looking at the letters on the painting. 2 words, his wife's name. The thing he had been trying to make visible for 6 years. Now visible in a room full of people who had believed the wrong thing for a decade. Visible under lights that had been pointed at it accidentally, by the kind of accident that sometimes occurs when a truth has been pressing against its container for long enough. "Yes," he said finally, "it is." What followed was not a single event, but a series of them, occurring over the course of an evening, and then weeks, and then months, in the way that consequential things actually unfold, rather than in the way they are subsequently narrated. The UV examination of the canvas was documented that night by Lena Brooks, who filed a condition report amendment the following morning that described, with the precise vocabulary of her training, what the ultraviolet light had revealed. Dr. Mercer, confronted with the report, initially characterized the inscription as possibly a restoration notation, a category of marking that conservators make on paintings for their own records. Though he knew, as he said this, that restoration notations do not include the names of people who died years after the painting was first sold. Eleanor Whitcomb, the museum's board chair, was called into an emergency meeting the following morning. She was a careful woman who had built the Whitcombs' reputation over 15 years, through a combination of fundraising skill and institutional caution, and she understood, sitting in the emergency meeting with Lena's report in front of her and Mercer across the table, that the institution had a choice about what kind of problem it was going to treat this as. She chose correctly, which was not an easy choice and was not a comfortable choice, but was the only choice available to someone who had spent 15 years telling donors and public visitors that the museum was committed to the integrity of its collection. An independent technical review was commissioned. Arthur Bell, who had operated his gallery for 45 years and who had for 6 years been carrying the knowledge that Mara had shown him early studies of the woman in blue light, long before the painting had appeared in Adrian Vale's catalog, gave his statement. He had kept photographs. He had kept the catalog from a small group show he had included Mara's other work in, which predated the Vale attribution by 4 years. He said, "I knew Mara was telling the truth. I said nothing because I was afraid of what it would cost me." He did not ask to be forgiven for this. He only asked to not leave the document with his silence inside it. Richard Vale, who managed Adrian's estate, and who had known since the acquisition that the provenance was not clean. There had been a notation in the estate files that described Scranvis as having an unresolved studio attribution question, which Richard had interpreted as something to be managed rather than something to be answered. Was interviewed by the Independent Review Committee. Several of his email communications from the period of the painting's sale were subpoenaed as part of a civil inquiry. They were not exculpatory. The review concluded in 14 weeks. Its conclusions were as thorough as the evidence permitted and more honest than the institutions involved had reason to hope for. The painting's authorship was reattributed to Mara Ellison, with a note in the catalog raisonné, acknowledging the full history of the attribution dispute, including the years in which the institution had declined to investigate it. The Richard Vale estate's claim to the work was suspended pending the outcome of the civil proceeding. Dr. Mercer placed himself on administrative leave at the board's request and did not return to his position. Caleb's conditions, delivered through his attorney in 3 pages that took him 2 evenings to write, were specific. Mara's name was to appear as primary creator, not co-creator, not with contributions from creator. The museum's technical report on the inscription was to be published in full. A public acknowledgement of the attribution history was to be included in all printed materials going forward. The loan of the painting, which Mara had never formally transferred, and which therefore belonged, as the civil proceeding would establish, to her estate, which meant to Caleb and June, was to be renegotiated under terms that included the museum's agreement to include 1 additional Mara Ellison work in the permanent collection. A free admission day for public school students from low-income districts was to be established as an annual event. June was not to be named or photographed in any institutional communications without explicit advance consent. There was one condition that was not in the written document. When the Whitcombs' legal team asked, in the 4th negotiating session, whether there was a financial settlement figure that would simplify the arrangement, Caleb said, "I don't want the museum to hang my wife's painting as evidence that it learned something. I want the museum to change how it decides whose work belongs on these walls." The legal team wrote this down without making eye contact. In the weeks after the inscription was made public, Caleb and June returned to their apartment and tried to live in the way that people try to live when something large has happened and the large thing has not finished its reverberations. June went to school. Caleb went to the restoration shop. He repaired a frame that had been damaged in shipping. He started a new frame for a small painting a client wanted mounted for the first time. On a Tuesday evening, June sat on the floor of the living room with the sketchbook open across her knees. Mara's sketchbook, the one with the studies, and she looked at the drawings for a long time. Did she know, June asked, that someone would see her name? Caleb was in the kitchen making tea. He came to the doorway with the 2 cups. "I think she hoped," he said, "but I think she mostly needed you to see it first, before anyone else." June looked at the drawings, the repeated figure in blue light, the annotated pigment notes, the small, careful handwriting in the margins. The date in the upper corner of the first study, March 1998. June had not been born yet. The painting had been made for someone who did not yet exist, which was one of the ways love works. "I see it," June said. Caleb sat down beside her. He looked at the drawings with her. He said, "I'm sorry it took this long." June said, "When was the soonest it could have happened?" He thought about this. He said, "Maybe this was always when it happened." June looked at a drawing. She turned a page to the next one. She said, "But you kept the sketchbook." "Yes," he said. "That's the part that mattered," she said. She did not say this to be kind. She said it because she was 8 years old and her understanding of situations was not complicated by the things that complicate adult understanding. And she had identified, with the accuracy of a child who has been paying attention, the single thing that had made everything else possible. 6 months after the technical review was published, the Whitcomb reopened the exhibition. The title of the exhibition was Mara Ellison, The Woman in Blue Light. The catalog no longer mentioned Adrian Vale in the context of the central painting, except in the historical account that documented how the attribution had come to exist and how it had been corrected. The wall panel beside the painting read, Mara Ellison American, 1976 to 2014, The Woman in Blue Light, 1998 oil and mixed pigment on canvas. Below this was a shorter panel. This work was misattributed for a period of more than 20 years. The Whitcomb Museum acknowledges this error, acknowledges the efforts of Caleb Ellison to correct it, and acknowledges that the structures which made this error possible are not unique to this institution. It was not a perfect statement. Caleb had reviewed it and found it adequate, which was the category of judgment he applied to institutional statements. Not good, but adequate. A statement that was good would have required the institution to have been different from the beginning, which was a higher standard than institutional statements can achieve by definition. On the morning of the reopening, Caleb and June arrived early. They came in through the front door. A young man at the door, a different guard from 6 months ago, said, "Good morning. Welcome." He checked their names on his list and said, "Miss Ellison, welcome." June looked at her father. "Daddy," she said quietly. "He said our name." "He did," Caleb said. They walked through the museum's front hall and into the exhibition. The painting was at the far end, in the position of prominence that the museum's directors had chosen after a long conversation about what placing the work centrally communicated, and whether they were prepared to communicate it. They had concluded they were. Caleb stood in front of the painting for a long time. He looked at the woman in the blue light, the angle of the head, the position of the left hand, the particular way the light moved through the composition from an unseen source above and to the left. He had been looking at this painting in reproductions for 6 years. Standing in front of it was different. The color was different. The texture of the surface was different. He could see the decisions in it, not just the result. He could see where Mara had worked and reworked, where she had been uncertain and then certain, where she had arrived at the thing she had been moving toward through all the studies in the sketchbook. He said quietly to the painting and to the room and to no one specifically, "They can't take it anymore." June put her hand against the glass of the protective frame. She did not cry, she smiled. It was the smile of a child who has been told for a long time that a thing belongs to her without being able to see it, and who is finally in the room. There are museums built to hold memory. And sometimes those same institutions become the places where memory is most effectively buried, because a burial requires an enclosure with good walls and controlled light and a list of authorized visitors, which is a description that applies equally to a gallery and a grave. Mara Ellison had no gallery when she was alive, no house, no committee, no institution with her name on its letterhead. She had a sketchbook. She had a studio she rented month to month. She had a husband who believed her and a daughter she was making something for. The people who held the institution's apparatus, the authentication committees, the provenance reviewers, the curators who decided what hung where and under whose name, had no particular reason to look at her carefully, and several structural reasons not to. A painting attributed to Adrian Vale was worth $40 million. A painting attributed to an unknown black woman who had died before making her reputation was worth considerably less. The market logic was clear and the institutional logic followed it, and this is the mechanism by which names are erased. Not always with malice, but with the grinding preference for the explanation that requires the least disruption to the existing account. Caleb Ellison had been disrupting the existing account for 6 years with a sketchbook and a restoration shop worker's salary, and the specific stubbornness of a man who made a promise in a hospital room to someone who could no longer hear him keep it. He had not won because he was powerful. He had won because he had not accepted the loss, and because under the painting, in the layer no one had looked at, his wife had put her name where it could not be removed without destroying the thing itself. Some truths are like that. They live in the substrate. They survive the surface. They wait for someone to point the right light at the right angle, and then they appear. June Ellison walked through the front door of the museum and into the room where her mother's name was on the wall, and she did not enter as a guest who had been permitted. She did not enter as the daughter of a man who had caused a problem and been accommodated. She entered as the child of Mara Ellison, the woman in the blue light, who had made something beautiful, who had never, not even in the substrate, agreed to disappear.